Tonight, we begin with a development that intelligence officials in Washington, London, and Kiev had anticipated, dismissed, and ultimately prepared for. A claim that unfolded not over weeks or months of investigation, but in a single night that shook the Kremlin's narrative. A single night that exposed the cracks in Moscow's credibility. A single night that forced the world to ask a question Russia still cannot answer. What Moscow did this week crossed a line that Western intelligence had hoped would hold the line between wartime propaganda and outright fabrication. And when that line broke, Ukraine did not hesitate. They responded with clarity, with defiance, and with a demand that should have been simple: show us the evidence. Moscow's answer? Silence. Not the silence of a nation preparing its case, not the silence of investigators gathering facts, but the silence of a government that made an accusation it cannot prove. Tonight, as the world waits for Russia to substantiate its extraordinary claim that Ukraine launched a drone attack on Vladimir Putin's residence in the heart of Moscow, the Kremlin has offered nothing: no debris analysis, no intercepted communications, no flight path data, no credible evidence of any kind. And in that silence, a different story is emerging. For months now, there had been signals not from official Russian state media, not from the Ministry of Defense, just signals that Moscow was preparing something unusual. Russia has been aggressive, yes, but they have been predictable in their aggression. Their moves have followed a certain logic, a rhythm, almost a choreography that Western analysts had learned to read. Every escalation came with a purpose. Every threat came with a demand. Every provocation came with a propaganda package ready for distribution. But what set off alarm bells in Langley, in London, and Brussels this week was that the choreography went silent. Intelligence officials who monitor Russian state media know the indicators: the sudden coordination of messaging across multiple outlets, the pre-positioning of narratives before events occur, the mysterious leaks to friendly journalists, the sudden appearance of evidence that seems too convenient. All of that went quiet. And whenever Moscow goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. What came next was louder than anyone expected. Russian state television broadcast footage, grainy, shaky, suspiciously edited footage, showing what they claimed was a drone attack on the Kremlin itself. Not a military base on the front lines. Not a logistics hub in occupied territory, the Kremlin. Vladimir Putin's residence, the symbolic heart of Russian power. Within hours, Russian officials were on every available platform making the most serious accusation imaginable: that Ukraine had attempted to assassinate the president of the Russian Federation. It was an extraordinary claim, and extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Evidence that Moscow has refused to provide. Early Wednesday morning, intelligence analysts detected what they described as a coordinated Russian media operation, including messaging patterns that had not been activated in over 18 months. These are the kinds of information warfare tactics that Moscow only deploys when they are signaling something very specific: a major offensive, a significant policy shift, or a justification for escalation. Western observers didn't know which category this fell into or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Russia was changing posture. And when a nuclear-armed state shifts posture without explanation, even by the smallest measure, every intelligence agency on Earth pays attention. The footage itself raised immediate questions. The video showed what appeared to be a small drone approaching the Kremlin Senate Palace dome, followed by a flash and a small amount of smoke. No significant damage was visible. No casualties were reported. Vladimir Putin was not in the building at the time, a fact Russian officials confirmed only after making their assassination claim. But here's what intelligence analysts noticed immediately. The Kremlin is one of the most heavily defended airspaces in Russia. It sits in the center of Moscow, surrounded by air defense systems, radar installations, electronic warfare equipment, and constant security surveillance. And the idea that a small drone could penetrate all of those defenses, reach the Kremlin dome, and detonate while conveniently being filmed from multiple angles strained credibility from the first frame. Former intelligence officials speaking to multiple outlets described the footage as highly suspicious. Military analysts called the scenario operationally implausible. One retired CIA officer put it more bluntly: this has all the hallmarks of a staged event. And when pressed for evidence and when pressed for Moscow's response was telling. They offered accusations, they offered condemnations, they offered threats. What they did not offer was proof. The warning issued by Ukrainian officials was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was categorical. Source after source, official after official, described Russia's accusation as baseless, provocative, and perhaps most importantly, designed to justify further attacks on Ukrainian civilians, but propaganda only works if the target hesitates. Ukraine did not. In fact, their response today was among the most direct and unequivocal we've seen in the entire conflict. Here's what we know. Within hours of Russia's claim, Ukraine issued a complete denial at every level of government. These weren't carefully worded diplomatic statements designed to preserve ambiguity. These were full-throated rejection statements that Ukraine only makes when they are prepared to stake their international credibility on the truth. President Volodymyr Zelensky addressed the accusation directly. His office released a statement calling the claims a provocation and noting that Ukraine focuses its military operations on legitimate targets within its own territory, not symbolic attacks that would serve only Russian propaganda purposes. Ukrainian intelligence officials went further. They suggested that the entire incident appeared to be a false flag operation, a staged event designed to justify Russian escalation and to distract from battlefield failures. Mikhailo Podolyak, a senior advisor to Zelensky, posted on social media what many were thinking: Russia was creating pretexts for terror, and the timing Ukrainian officials noted was not coincidental. The alleged attack came just days before Russia's Victory Day celebrations, the annual military parade that serves as the centerpiece of Putin's domestic propaganda. An assassination attempt just before the most important day on Russia's patriotic calendar? It was too convenient, too perfectly timed. Too useful for a government that has struggled to explain why its special military operation has stretched into its second year with no end in sight. Tonight, multiple intelligence sources confirmed that Western agencies have been monitoring Russian state media operations with unusual intensity since the incident was first reported. What they found was revealing. The Russian media response was not organic, it was coordinated. Multiple state outlets began reporting the same narrative, using the same language, within minutes of the footage's release. Talking points appeared simultaneously across television, print, and social media platforms. Official statements from government ministries were released in rapid succession, each one building on the last, each one escalating the rhetoric. This is the signature of a planned information operation, not breaking news, not a government responding to an unexpected crisis, a script. Western analysts noted that the footage itself showed characteristics inconsistent with a genuine attack. The camera angles suggested, for knowledge of the event, the explosion was small enough to cause minimal damage, but visible enough to be captured clearly. The response from Kremlin security appeared delayed and muted. There was no evident anti-aircraft response during the supposed attack. In other words, either Russia's vaunted air defense systems completely failed to protect the most important building in the country, or the event was staged. Moscow has not addressed these inconsistencies. They have not released radar data. They have not produced drone debris for independent analysis. They have not allowed international investigators to examine the site. They have, in essence, asked the world to trust them. This is what made Ukraine's response so pointed. Russia's claim wasn't just implausible, it was insulting. It assumed that the international community would accept accusations without evidence. It assumed that the media would amplify the narrative without scrutiny. It assumed that Ukraine would be forced onto the defensive, denying allegations rather than focusing on the truth. But Ukraine, understanding that playbook, responded with force. Not military force, rhetorical force, evidentiary force. They challenged Russia to prove what it was claiming. They demanded transparency. They called for international investigation. And when Russia refused, the silence spoke louder than any accusation. And here's where the story becomes even more significant. Intelligence analysts now believe that Russia's drone claim was designed to test the credibility of Western support after months of military aid and diplomatic backing for Ukraine. Moscow wanted to see whether the United States and its allies would waver, whether they would distance themselves from Kyiv, whether they would demand explanations rather than offering solidarity. But instead, the opposite happened. Western governments didn't condemn Ukraine. They expressed skepticism toward Russia with a unanimity that was so immediate, so coordinated, that even the Kremlin noticed. You don't get Moscow's attention easily, but this week, the West did. Defense officials speaking with journalists under anonymity described Russia's accusation as strategic theater, a way to shift the narrative away from battlefield losses and toward a victimhood frame. But Ukraine proved today that they remain both credible and capable. Their denials were not only firm, they were substantiated with logic that even neutral observers found compelling. Why would Ukraine launch a symbolic attack on the Kremlin when they are winning the information war? Why would they risk international support for an operation with no military value? Why would they hand Russia exactly the propaganda victory it has been seeking? The answers were obvious. They wouldn't, and that logic matters because it shows the fundamental weakness of Russia's position. It shows that Moscow is not responding to Ukrainian aggression. They are manufacturing it, and they are doing so with decreasing skill. As reports continue coming in throughout the week, we learned more about the international response to Russia's claims. The United States State Department expressed skepticism, noting that Russia had provided no evidence to support its accusations. British officials questioned the plausibility of the attack given Moscow's air defense capabilities. All European Union representatives called for transparency and independent verification, neither of which Russia has provided. NATO leadership noted the pattern of Russian disinformation and urged member states to approach the claims with appropriate caution. This wasn't just doubt. This wasn't just diplomatic hedging. This was coordinated skepticism. This was institutional rejection of Russian narratives. And institutional credibility is the one thing Moscow has struggled to maintain since the invasion began. For every propaganda victory they have claimed, the international community has countered with something that undermined it. For every narrative they have pushed, investigators and journalists have exposed the inconsistencies. For every accusation they have made, the lack of evidence has spoken louder than the claims themselves. Russia is losing the information war. And this week's drone claim may be the clearest evidence yet of just how badly. Remember, Moscow thought this war would last days. They thought Kiev would fall without resistance. They thought Ukraine's government would collapse. They thought the West would lose interest. They thought sanctions would fade. They thought military aid would dry up. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Ukraine is still standing. Kyiv remains the seat of a defiant government. Western support has increased, not diminished. Sanctions have tightened, not loosened. Military aid continues to flow in quantities Russia never anticipated, and the international community has developed a collective immunity to Russian disinformation that would have been unthinkable 2 years ago. Every false claim, every staged event, every manufactured crisis, they have all contributed to a credibility deficit that Russia cannot overcome with more of the same tactics. And this week, that deficit was on full display. Meanwhile, Ukraine's President Zelensky addressed his nation and the international community in a measured, pointed speech. He said, "We are focused on liberating our territory, not on symbolic gestures that serve only Russian propaganda." He said, "Ukraine does not attack civilians or engage in terrorism. That is Russia's method, not ours." And he said, "The world should ask a simple question. Where is the evidence? If Russia has proof, let them show it. If they cannot, then we know what this really is." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a wartime leader who understands that credibility is a weapon, and Ukraine has been winning the credibility war from the beginning. Every verified Russian atrocity, every documented attack on civilian infrastructure, every broken ceasefire, every false promise, every exposed lie, they have all contributed to an international consensus that Ukraine tells the truth and Russia does not. This week's drone claim will not change that equation. If anything, it will reinforce it. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Russia's drone claim wasn't isolated. Along with the accusation against Ukraine, Russian state media launched a coordinated campaign calling for retaliation against Ukrainian leadership. Russian military bloggers, often used to signal policy directions, began discussing expanded targeting of civilian infrastructure. Russian officials made statements suggesting that the assassination attempt justified any response. All of this happened within the same 48-hour period. When Russia moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. This wasn't just a propaganda operation, it was preparation. Preparation for what exactly remains unclear. But the pattern suggests that Moscow is building a justification file, a collection of manufactured grievances that can be cited whenever they choose to escalate. The drone claim, whether believed internationally or not, serves that purpose. It becomes part of the record Russia can point to when justifying future actions. They tried to kill our president, Moscow can say. Everything we do now is self-defense. That's the danger. Not that the world believes the claim, but that Russia will act as if the claim were true, regardless of evidence. Western analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Russia is preparing a major offensive and needs domestic justification for the casualties it will produce. Another is that Russia is attempting to fracture Western unity by forcing allies to take positions on an unverifiable claim. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Russia is attempting to establish a pretext for attacks on Ukrainian government leadership, framing any such attack as retaliation rather than escalation. But today, Ukraine took that card off the table. They didn't equivocate. They didn't offer conditional denials. They didn't engage with the premise of the accusation. They rejected it entirely and demanded proof. That response matters because it denies Russia the ambiguity they need. There is no both sides framing available here. One side has made an accusation. One side has refused to provide evidence, and the international community has noticed. What we're watching now is a test of resolve. Russia wants to see if accusations alone can shift international opinion. Ukraine wants to show that credibility cannot be manufactured with grainy footage and coordinated talking points. The United States wants to prevent an escalation spiral based on fabricated events. And Europe wants to prevent the information environment from becoming so polluted that truth becomes indistinguishable from propaganda. The stakes of this test extend far beyond this single incident. If Russia succeeds, if accusations without evidence become accepted currency, then the entire framework of international accountability collapses. If Russia fails, if the international community maintains its demand for proof, then a new standard has been established. A standard that says claims require evidence. A standard that says credibility is earned, not asserted. A standard that may be the most important legacy of this conflict. Tonight, we've heard from intelligence sources who are now monitoring Russian military movements with heightened attention. They say there is no evidence of imminent escalation beyond existing patterns. They say Russian military operations continue at the same tempo as before the drone claim. And they say Moscow's decision to make this accusation without evidence is likely part of a broader information strategy intended to maintain domestic support rather than trigger international action. But Ukraine is not relaxing. In fact, Ukraine is doubling down on its military operations, demonstrating that Russian propaganda will not deter their strategic objectives. Their response today, calm, confident, and evidence-based, sent a message to Moscow that Ukraine will not be distracted by fabrications. And it sent a message to the West that Ukraine remains a credible partner whose word can be trusted. The credibility gap between Ukraine's verified claims and Russia's unsubstantiated accusations may ultimately be more decisive than any single battle. Wars are won with weapons, but they are sustained with truth. And on that front, Ukraine continues to prevail. As the week goes on, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Russia hoped to achieve with this accusation. What we do know is that the international response was appropriate. It maintained pressure on Russia to provide evidence. It protected Ukraine from unfounded allegations. And it reinforced the principle that accusations alone are not enough. What happens next will depend on what Moscow does in the coming days. If they quietly drop the claim, this moment will be remembered as another failed Russian information operation. If they escalate based on their own fabricated pretext, Ukraine and its allies have already shown they are prepared to respond. They have shown they are watching. They have shown they are documenting. They have shown they are ready. The refusal to provide evidence is itself evidence. Evidence of a government that cannot distinguish between truth and narrative. Evidence of a propaganda machine running low on credible material. Evidence of a regime that has lied so often that even its accusations sound like confessions. And tonight, for the first time in months, Moscow appears to be recalculating. The Kremlin's messaging is quieter. The usual amplification networks are less active. The expected escalation has not materialized. And when Moscow is quiet, it means they are reassessing. It means they are choosing their next move carefully. Because tonight, Russia learned something they have learned many times but refuse to accept. Credibility cannot be manufactured. Evidence cannot be replaced with volume. And the world is no longer willing to take Moscow's word for anything. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear: Ukraine's position is stronger than Russia's accusations. The international community's skepticism is more powerful than Moscow's propaganda. And the truth, as always, will outlast the lies designed to obscure it. And we will be here watching every detail as the next phase unfolds. YouTube channel.